Thanks everybody for joining today. We're going to have a joint conversation between Source Defense and our friends at Sikich over tackling the eSkimming requirements in the payment card industry data security standard version 4.0. Maybe I'll turn off this screen so that folks can see our faces here for introductions. My name is Matt McGuirk. I am a solution architect here at Source Defense. I've been working in this area for about 6 years now, which is never thought I'd get there that very long, but 15 years before that in web application development and security. And I'm pleased to be able to speak with you today. I'm joined by Ruth Barra from our friends at Sikich. Ruth, would you mind giving us a few words about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm happy to be here with you. I am a managing consultant with Sikich within our governance, risk, and compliance division. Very involved with PCI for a lot of years, going back to when the individual card brands sort of started off with their own programs. So I'm very excited to be here today with Source Defense to talk a little bit about these new requirements and what maybe some next steps could be.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ruth. What we're going to do here structure-wise, for anybody who's curious, I'm going to speak a little bit here up front about these requirements from a practical standpoint. Like, what is the actual underlying security problem that we're trying to solve, and where have we seen it? I'm going to try to keep that brief so that we can get on some discussion. And with that in mind, if anyone has questions or comments or concerns as we go through here, feel free to enter them into the chat. We'll bring those into the mix as we go and make sure that they get addressed. And without further ado, let me share my screen here and we'll hop in. So as we mentioned a couple times, we are talking about new features or requirements in PCI DSS 4. We're talking about two things in very specific requirements, number 643 and 1161. And those have to deal with payment page security, web pages that contain card data or show it or process it. As a brief aside, payment's a little bit of misnomer. It just means kind of web page with card data in it. The overall point that we like to make here is that this is an area of cybersecurity that, in most generic, I would call web application client-side security, in contrast to server-side security. We've all got tons of bells and whistles and firewalls and technologies and et cetera to make sure our application servers and web servers and databases are locked down. However, securing the web pages themselves is a little bit of a new frontier in some ways, and hence the new requirements. The root cause of all this trouble is JavaScript. JavaScript is the language that makes everything inside of a web page interactive, whether that's clicking a button to add something to a shopping cart, entering a zip code to get shipping information, or et cetera. That's all JavaScript. The terms you may have heard around JavaScript client-side security could include things like eSkimming, form jacking, click jacking, mage cart attack. Those are all the same thing that rolls up into client-side attack and payment page script in this context. There are no native security controls in JavaScript, meaning that when web browsers implemented this technology about 30 years ago, in fact, that 30-year anniversary may have just come up. It was 1994. 30 years ago, nobody thought about security. They just kind of threw this thing out there in about 10 business days, and here we are now because of that. So when we talk about JavaScript, to put it a little bit more descriptively or illustratively, we're talking about integrations like marketing tools. So most commonly analytics, Facebook Connect, Twitter, I guess X now, other tools like that, as well as your own, what we would call first-party code, meaning what a merchant would develop themselves in-house to make the website what it is, what's unique about it. So those are two different flavors of this problem that both have to be considered when we're looking at payment page security. When we look at this from a little bit of a architectural standpoint, the way an attack can happen, despite maybe what you've seen before, is not that complex really, because of that wide security gap that JavaScript introduces. Here in the middle of my screen, I've got a web browser. When a web browser connects to a web server, they exchange information, content, etc. Along the way, you've got what I would call a traditional cybersecurity software stack. So that's things like a firewall, a WAF, TLS, SSL, other technologies that are relevant in other parts of DSS. However, when you're speaking about these two requirements, they become, I don't want to say irrelevant, but they don't solve or address the problem. Those two flavors of JavaScript execute inside of the browser. And we're talking about that, 250 milliseconds or something between typing in website.com and the visitor interacting with it. So your first party JavaScript is introduced and the web page begins to execute. The web page will also request what we would call third or fourth or fifth party JavaScript. The distinction here, which is important, is that this stuff exists on another server beyond the merchant's control. It's on another part of the internet that the web browser requests on the fly. And that's problematic because obviously the merchant does not control these servers or their security teams or even their supply chain. As you can see here, there's also a supply chain effect, fourth, fifth, sixth. All of that opens up a huge amount of risk because there's no way to control what these folks do as they're executing inside of the page. And also that execution, right, is happening out here in browser land. It's not happening on a corporate network or even in a CDE, depending on how you define that, or et cetera. It's just a browser out in the world. So how do we monitor this or know about it if it's Jane Smith's computer somewhere out in browser land? The attackers in the world, mage card attackers, other groups or individuals know about this environment that's so ripe for exploitation. And usually what they'll do is break into either the first party code, being a breach of a merchant's own infrastructure, or social engineering to get a developer to integrate bad code, or more commonly, more severely, a third party attack where some part of the web page supply chain is compromised. And then there's really not even any breach, so to speak, of the merchant's infrastructure. It's just that this supply chain relationship has left them vulnerable and therefore allowed the attacker to get in through that kind of vector. Most commonly, this is used for what I would call data exfiltration, or more simply, theft of information. This is where you get skimming from, right? If they can just take the credit card off the page and use it from the browser, then they're in really good shape in terms of their, motivations as an attacker. I want to show you guys a practical example of this because I think it's kind of interesting. I'm going to show you what an attack would look like if it were to happen. I'm going to use the New York Times as an example here, but I want to be very abundantly clear. We haven't done anything to the New York Times website. I've manipulated my web browser in such a way that it has an attack injected into it, but there's no need to consult law enforcement or anything like that after this demonstration. So the basic idea here is that the Times, like every modern website, has a bunch of code in it that we can see through developer tools, and we can appreciate that it's there. But not every piece of this is under the Times control. And as you can see here, like I was mentioning a moment before, a lot of this, as you can see at the bottom of this list, a lot of this does come from the New York Times itself. A lot of it comes from other parts of the internet, just to illustrate that problem I was just talking about. So as I go here to log into a New York Times account, you can see that I do have, split this, I do have the Times login page here. I also have on the right this black and green box. So what this is a client-side attack that has successfully gotten into my web browser. I've injected. In reality, these attacks do not have like a terminal console view kind of thing that's going on. I add those for my demonstration, but it helps to show exactly what this attack can do while it's hanging out in the background invisibly from the visitor's perspective. So you can see here as I begin to type that the attack can capture whatever I type into the browser. Like I said, it has complete control over the visitor experience and their data. The attackers can also inject their own content, manipulate what the web page looks like and what it does, such that they can present whatever they want. The attacker can show the visitor whatever is useful to them in order to extract information. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but when we think about the scope of these requirements around iframes and payment gateway providers and the relationship between a merchant and et cetera, the reason the scope has expanded a little bit from 321 is that if an attacker can get into the parent page where an iframe is embedded, they could do something like this, where they change the content of the page to be malicious and kind of through social engineering sort of approach, they can get the data. Sometimes for me, as a kind of engineered brained person, you start to think about like, well, how could they get into the code that's secure inside of the thing? And it's like, well, that's not quite the right way to frame it. The attacker just wants to get the card number. So if they can successfully do that through, hook or crook, that's how they will do it. They can then extract this information and send it wherever they want on the internet. My demonstration just forwards us to a contact us page because I don't want to interact with the Times website at all. But the key takeaway there is that from a visitor perspective, this can be entirely transparent. Again, to reinforce that term skimmer, like it just skims the data off. The visitor can just be forwarded to the normal login process. They have no idea it happened. And to reiterate, the hosting website didn't really see any of this either. It just happened in my web browser. So that's why these attacks are so both severe and also persistent. Like it's just hard to see this happening unless you got something going on. What we're going to do now is pivot to the requirements themselves. So PCI DSS 643 and 1161. And Ruth, given that you are the expert in this area, I thought if you wouldn't mind just talking a little bit about the language here and high level what this requires of merchants.
Absolutely. And that's really the biggest question or understanding that merchants have had around these two new requirements, sort of the why. I have engaged the services of a PCI validated third-party service provider because I don't want to play with cardholder data. I'm a merchant, I want to sell my goods and services, and I want to touch that as little as possible. And where the gap came in and why these requirements were necessary is that if you are, for example, a merchant that is using an iframe or a hosted payment page, while you're not actually storing, processing, or transmitting that cardholder data, it's being rendered, that page, that iframe is being rendered in the consumer's browser. The information is collected. It's being sent directly to your PCI validated third-party service provider. However, the web server upon which that, the web server that includes that redirect mechanism or that embedded payment page can still impact the security of that handoff to the third-party service provider. And that's what these requirements are meant to address and to close that gap somewhat. So with that in mind, this requirement 6.4.3 really focuses first and foremost on, in order to provide the proper protections, you need to know what are the payment scripts that are running. What am I running? You need to inventory and understand what you're running, what third or fourth party scripts are also being run as a part of the pages that you're presenting. You need to know what they are, therefore you need to inventory them. You need to be sure that they're required. There's business justification for those. They need to be authorized. Someone says, I agree, yes, these are necessary for our business needs. We are not unnecessarily introducing these additional scripts into our environment. There needs to be, sort of a balance between what's going to help our business, and we don't want to unnecessarily pull in things that are risky without that justification. And then you need to have some sort of means of ensuring the integrity of those pages. So that's really sort of the intention around 6.4.3 is addressing the first piece, which is you have to know what you have in order to protect it. And you need to make sure that what you have is really necessary and that it is approved. So that's really where 6.4.3 comes in. Couple of different exceptions, I would say, around 6.4.3, and this is specifically for the merchants. If you are an SAQA merchant, then obviously 6.4.3 applies to you. It applies to the, as I mentioned before, the web server that includes that redirect mechanism or is pulling in that hosted payment page or form. There is an that need to protect that, as well as SAQAEP. So you may be rendering perhaps some part of that payment page from your website, still sending the data that's collected to the third-party service provider. But again, that mechanism that provides the handoff needs to be protected. So that's really sort of a quick and dirty on 6.4.3. Obviously, as a service provider, if you're providing those payment page scripts, you're providing the iframe, you're providing hosted payment pages, then obviously 6.4.3 applies to you as well.
And I think and I saw a couple of questions come through, and we'll dive into them deeper if we need to. But I think one question was security provider. I'm sorry. How do these requirements apply to a service provider? And I think Ruth, you just hit it on the head, which is that if a service provider has a payment page that they're providing, that payment page would also be in scope. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes, correct.
Cool.
And oh, sorry. I was going to say, you see that when you look at, if you happen to be a service provider that completes the SAQD for service providers, you will see the inclusion of that requirement, as well as obviously if you're a level 1, you complete a level 1 assessment as a service provider, then obviously if you're providing those payment type mechanisms, that would apply to you as well.
Excellent. Yeah. And then the complementary, if you will, requirement that we see is 11.6.1. Basically, and Ruth, I'll let you expand on this, but I see this one as tamper proofing, more or less, meaning that 6.4 requires these controls, and we also need a way to make sure those controls don't get tampered with, right?
Right, absolutely. So 6.4.3 says, what do we have? Yes, we need to have it. It's authorized, it's approved. And you have to have a means of maintaining the integrity of that mechanism. 11.6.1 is the means by which you would assure that integrity, by making sure that if something is tampered with or substituted or changed in some way, you know about it. You have an opportunity to determine rather quickly, is the intention, whether or not that was something that you knew about and authorized, or is it in fact some sort of nefarious attempt to alter or change or impact those payment pages in a way that exposes data that was not intended to be exposed.
Yeah, they're complementary in a lot of ways. There's one other note in requirement 11, which is kind of its like own little satellite issue amounts to this, which is the HTTP response header monitoring, which is the only one that's like everything else is JavaScript and scripts and client side. Web headers are very important in this context too. For anyone who's new to that term, an HTTP response header or web header is just like the metadata that goes back and forth between the server and the browser. It tells the browser how to interpret the web page content. And that metadata can include security controls, like don't open a frame from the wrong place. It tells the browser to do that. So super important to get those monitored because they could indicate a compromise or even just a misconfiguration that degrades the overall web app security. So that one's always kind of like a non sequitur in the conversation a little bit, but it is in there and it's important. I see the questions filtering in. Thank you. We're gonna hop in here very shortly. I want to talk about the guidance that that's issued in 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, and some of my practical experience that I've seen over the 5.5 years I've been talking to folks about these issues. One way we see this go. So let me describe the technologies that are in there. There's basically two different things that are described in DSS: it's content security policy and sub-resource integrity, CSP and SRI. They are usually implemented together. Content security policy is, to be reductive about it, a whitelisting, blacklisting approach, meaning that one would inventory all of the scripts on their site. They would write up a list of those. They would provide them, put them on the web server, basically. And then the web browser would be served that list and it would have to obey it. It would not be able to load content that was not from that list. And then sub-resource integrity is a mechanism to hash or fingerprint a file and then compare that file at the time it's rendered with a known good signature. So basically saying that we know this copy of this script file is valid and that it does not contain any security problems and it's good to go. And the browser should only ever load that version, that instance of the file. These are often what I call well-intentioned technologies. I personally believe that they were kind of spec'd out and put into the World Wide Web Consortium HTTP spec as to solve a particular problem, which would be like, if you control the entire, let's imagine we just have like the world's simplest web application. It's a timesheet thing somewhere on an intranet. If you own all the code for that, and you control where it's hosted and when the code is released and when it's updated and all that stuff. If you have all that in-house and under control, then these will work pretty well for you because you can say, yes, this is the host where the front end code lives. And when we patch it up, we'll change the fingerprints and everything else. Because if anyone changes the infrastructure, like where the file lives, or anyone changes the version of the file, then CSP and SRI will block that script from loading. So in the case where you control everything, that's fine. In a case where you have third-party code, though, those marketing tools, those outside integrations that originate from foreign servers at the time of rendering, of execution, you have no control over Google pushing a new version of their software and potentially breaking the analytics on the site, or modifying their infrastructure so the code loads from somewhere slightly different because of load balancing or whatever. And then more, actually even trickier, with this kind of code is that it's often modified at the time of request. So what I mean is the web browser asks a server for the code, and the server, before it sends it back, changes it. It adds a user token to it. It does something called cache busting, which is a technique to add unique random information to the code, so it's always the freshest version of the script. So what I'm trying to say is, how do you fingerprint something that's changing all the time? How do you anticipate changes from your vendors in terms of their infrastructure? Like I said, well-intentioned technology is good for a specific use case, but not super duper great for this particular one. And then for the more bookkeeping or administrative sides of the requirements, spreadsheets and outside business automation workflow tools, perhaps, or for authorization, justification. So that, it's these different things put together are what organizations attempt and what we've seen folks do. And you can do it with success, but it's a serious resource hog, if you will. It takes a lot of people and process and time and money to do these things internally, unless you can dedicate multiple people to it. And obviously I have a bias in this, but that is truly the practical experience I've seen both in web development and kind of being a consultant to these things for a while. The other approach to this, which is in the guidance, is a proprietary tag management, by the way, just jargon for JavaScript, proprietary tag management system to prevent the execution of malicious code in the browser. And so this is what I call a tool-based approach. It is a vendor-based approach. It's what Source Defense does. But the merchants to whom I've been speaking, this is what folks seem to be zeroing in on for the gap this year, that it's one of the only practical ways to get this done. So I would advise folks on the phone, if it's not Source Defense, that's fine, but throw into your mix the tool-based approach, because otherwise you might find yourself going down a little bit of a rabbit hole with regards to rolling your own solution, is what I'm trying to say. What we do for this is provide a dashboard to sum this up. We've been doing this for a while. We solve the underlying security problem, and we've focused that down into one specific interface that makes these tasks very, very straightforward, so folks can get it off of their list. And this is the kind of approach that we find has most resonance with people. Things like automating the script inventory so that a tool is doing it for you, so that nobody has to do that manual analysis. Making sure that even the third and fourth and fifth party scripts, so things that come in through the supply chain, which can be really tricky to keep up to date in a content security policy solution, for instance, are indexed as well. And then also workflow tools that are specific to this task. Meaning script justification. Nobody woke up this morning saying, I would really like to inventory and justify all of my payment page scripts, especially if they're not in an application development group or something. GRC folks, you got a lot to do. Here's a specific workflow to get you through it. Web header monitoring, as well as event alerting, and actually something Source Defense does, which is specific to us and unique to us, is the ability to actually block malicious behavior on the fly. So rather than get into a remediate and response kind of loop, actually being able to have the tool in a certain way automate remediation, filter out negative behaviors before they can harm the visitor or expose card data, putting you in a better spot than outright blocking marketing scripts or leaving a gap in there. So a brief mention of what we do and how we do it. You can get your own version of our dashboard at sourcedefense.com/free PCI, and I'd be happy to, we'll throw that URL at the end as well. But if you want to see this data for your own website, it's freely available from us, these kind of modules and this kind of insight. So with that description of both the practical matter, the hows and whys underlying the requirements, the requirements themselves, and a little bit of discussion of the guidance. What we're going to do now is open it up to a little more free-form conversation. I'll go ahead and turn off our share here. And Ruth, if you don't mind, we can start handling some of these questions that have been coming through. Maybe we just want to, if you wouldn't mind, Ruth, just kind of reiterating that thing, because I hear it a lot. Let's talk about iframes, right? An iframe, as I'm sure folks on the phone are aware, is a way of embedding a web page in another web page. And so for years, what we've been doing is merchants have been working with payment gateway providers to embed a payment form such that that limits the scope pretty significantly. But that's changed with 4, right? Version 4. Would you agree with that?
It has. And what's changed is that from the merchant's perspective, you now have to comply with 6.4.3 because the web server that is providing or sort of calling that iframe from the third-party service provider can impact the security of that transmission, that handoff, the flow of that account data. And that's what's different. And that's what's been really sort of hard for merchants to wrap their heads around, especially those who say, hey, I really worked hard to reduce my PCI compliance requirements, SAQA type eligibility. But again, it really is closing that gap where you want to make sure that the integrity of the merchant web server that is embedding that iframe into their page is secured.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the head, and it's just that change of I mean, there's already put it scope, which is that if these attackers can get into the parent page, like we saw in the demo, they can make it do whatever they want. And that kind of, there's another question coming up, like if you had a hard redirect, and the way I sometimes say this is like, if you've got a page, if you've got a web page that says donate now, and that donate now button sends you to a payment gateway, like it's just, you click here and you go there. Under one interpretation, as far as I read it, of some of the SAQs, it says like, if the page contains a link to a payment page, that could be in scope. Where have you landed on that issue, Ruth, do you think?
Absolutely. And when it comes to redirects, there is a difference between 11.6.1 and 6.4.3. So 6.4.3 specifically says the merchant web server that includes that redirect is what's in scope for 6.4.3. However, if you are only using that URL redirect mechanism, then 11.6.1 can be answered as not applicable.
That's an interesting distinction. Yeah, I often just package the two together, but there are those kind of very fine-grained differentiators. Let's see, what else we got here? iframes still are valuable. I would say that they're still, I'm not trying to get on the payment gateway industry. I think they do valuable work and they descope. The question is, do iframes mitigate this risk? They transfer, in my opinion, they transfer risk and they get, payment gateway providers are very good at security and those kind of things, but it's as we've discussed, it doesn't obviate the merchant with these new requirements, in my opinion.
Right, absolutely, and that's a good way of phrasing it. You are transferring the risk somewhat to a third-party service provider so that actual cardholder data, you're not touching it within your systems or environment, but that little piece where you could still impact the security of it with that handoff is relevant and needed.
I think that's very well said. Here's a question, and we can both take a crack at this, although, we're both speaking in generals here. I think that's important to say. What's an experience-backed opinion on how an enterprise with 12 to 15 public-facing web payment pages can best solve for these requirements? And so, Ruth, I'm happy to take that first, unless you'd like to.
Sure, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think that, like I said, a tool-based approach is going to be the best way to do this. When I think through the work that I would have had, I'm imagining I'm still in web development land, and I'd have to go through this task landed on my desk. What I'm going to have to start to do is go through all of those pages. Let's say there are 15 of them. Do that work I showed the folks at the top of just loading those pages over and over again, seeing the scripts and writing them down. And then I'm also going to have to chase down all the relationships between all of those scripts, the outside vendors, who at my organization owns those vendors, and who who can give the sign off on why they're authorized and that kind of deal. And that was just the inventorying and the other parts. So the best approach to do this would be, again, I don't know, I am biased, but some kind of tool for this to automate away a lot of the process. Those first steps, I would say though, like inventorying, are valuable to do somewhat manually. I mean, like for the authorization and justification, people are going to have to think through why these scripts are there. There's no getting around a business having to understand the business requirements for those. So it's, heightened knowledge overall is always going to be a human endeavor. Beyond that, figuring out some way to add to the web pages the thing that does those requirements for you, or even scans externally to get you started on those requirements is just the only realistic way, in my opinion, to do these things.
And I agree. And Matt, that really comes down to the business decision of a tool is awesome in a scenario like that, and probably maybe your best bet. It's the balance between the cost of the tool or the internal cost of the resources that you would need to maintain if you were to try to do something in a manual way or try to do something like SRI or CSP. So it really is a balance between what's going to cost you more.
Yeah, I think that holistic cost is the important thing, which is that it's okay. So again, speaking with as an application developer, this is one of those problems where I would have gone like, yeah, let's do this. This sounds like a really interesting problem to solve. And then it's like 6 months later and your boss is saying, why didn't you solve that problem? It's that kind of thing where it's sometimes our technical ambition outstrips our ability to deliver is what I'm trying to say here. Let's see here. Is there anything external PCI auditors will need to see prior to March 31st, 2025 if it's if these requirements aren't solved in 2024? So I guess as folks are looking forward to their new assessments, what would an assessor be interested in? And let's broaden it, just make it a little easier with gaps in general in DSS4. Like, what do assessors want to see?
Yeah, absolutely. So there will be, for this year, meaning from March 31st of 2024 to March 31st of 2025, there is no more 3.2.1. Let's call that gone in 3 days. There will be controls such as 6.4.3, 11.6.1 that you have not yet implemented. PCI has given that grace period by saying their best practice until that time. As we're going through assessments today, and we will continue through March 31st of 2025, we are talking to clients. Do you have this in place? There are new requirements that clients have already had in place. We'll report on those. If there's a best practice requirement that you have not yet implemented, then obviously we would answer that it's not applicable, and then we would explain that this is a requirement that is best practice until 2025, and the entity has not yet implemented it. Where it might get a little bit tricky time frame wise, prior to March 31st of 2025, anything that has an effective date of that date means after March 31st of 2025, you must demonstrate compliance. If we're doing your assessment in January of 2025 and it's going to wrap up before March 31st of 2025, obviously you're still in the best practice, grace period. If you have an assessment that is going to cross that March 31st of 2025 date, so let's say we start your assessment in February, our timelines and your compliance date says we wrap up in June. Obviously, we as assessors are going to look for those controls to be in place and look for you to be able to demonstrate that you have those in place. What's not going to happen is we're not going to expect to see evidence that you had those things in place prior to March 31st of 2025 if you did not have those things in place yet.
I think that's precisely why we have you here, Ruth, is that one's well beyond my ken. So yeah, the dates are important. What I've heard from folks is that there's a number of gaps, obviously, that have been introduced by version 4.0. People are prioritizing them differently. There are some that are more onerous, that are more difficult to solve than others. This one, I think if folks take the right approach, they can kind of hit it and quit it. Whereas that it is a new issue, it is something that people didn't necessarily expect, and it expands the scope. It is challenging to solve, but it can be solved relatively quickly if you want to get it off the list and not kind of like have it lagging through the next year. So it's hopefully some like source events, it could be easier to do it that way. Looking for other questions. Let's see. How about this one? Mobile applications, and I'll take a crack at this first. So mobile applications, are they in scope for 6.4.3? Do these have, so the trick here is that like a lot of this is payment page, web page. If we're talking about a fully blown, natively written mobile application, something written in Objective-C or in another language that's compiled to run in Android or iOS, those are not in scope for 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, in my opinion. Those totally native, written, etc. Obviously, you got other concerns. If it's processing card data, but for these two, that's not the case. However, kind of a little caveat to that is that those kind of applications, mobile applications, are sometimes what I would call a web view, meaning it's basically a wrapper. Like when you tap on the icon, it's really launching a web browser that then hits a web server somewhere. And the web developers or app developers do this because it's easier to unify your overall development. So you can make a web application that looks like a web application in a browser, and then really easily get a mobile application out the door, because basically you're just reskinning a web browser that serves web pages into the phone or the tablet, et cetera. So that's a case where folks want to be careful that they have a full idea of their organization and where the card data is, because there's a chance that you're shipping out a mobile app that is valid or is in scope for 643 that might have been overlooked, just thinking it's a mobile app and we're done. So that's my take on it.
Yes, that is absolutely what I would agree with, for sure.
Cool. Let's see. If anybody else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat here. We are happy to answer them. This is a more general one, Ruth, and I'll see what you think of it. Which new areas of DSS4 will need more QSA discretion as opposed to ones that are very cut and dry, kind of box checker sort of things? Have you seen some that are more interesting to think about, I guess?
I would not say that I feel that way, really. There is one interesting requirement that we've talked about internally. Most of the requirements, I will say, are very clear, either in what is the defined approach, exactly how are you expected to implement this control, and the objective, right? This is the objective of the control. There was an interesting one that we talked about internally quite a bit and have had some conversations with our clients. So there's a new requirement. It's not a new requirement. So under requirement number 4.2.2, it has to do with sending PAN data via end user messaging technologies. So in 3.2.1, the wording was a little bit different. So it said, never send, and I'm paraphrasing, never send unprotected PAN via end user messaging technologies, email, chat, etc. Yes, we get it. Same concept, a little bit of a different wording with 4.2.2, I think is the number. You have to bear with me. I'm still not quite memorizing all the numbers yet, but it's still the same sort of requirement around sending PAN data via end user messaging technologies. But there was something interesting that was included in the applicability notes. So it wasn't wording that was included in the control itself, but in the applicability notes, it talks a little bit about the discovery of unintended PAN data. So a quick example is you do not have email as a means of your customer base sending you cardholder data. However, if you're in the customer service organization where you're selling things or you have subscription type services, you're going to have someone who's going to say, I tried to renew my service, it expires tomorrow and I had a problem. So here's my credit card number. Please make sure it gets in under the deadline. Not a payment channel. You never intended it. But the wording says you either have to include that as a PCI in scope environment, or you have to prevent it from happening. So the wording we talked about quite a bit. You're never going to be able to completely prevent that. No matter what technology you're using, when you look at DLP tools for email and the enterprise level document offerings like a box.com, they have DLP tools available where you can say, hey, if it looks like a credit card number, quarantine it or alert me. Those tools, sometimes the number of false positives cause you to sort of put it into alerting mode rather than blocking mode. So can you prevent it from coming in? Not 100%. So really it is the intention to say, hey, all reasonable measures have been taken to prevent that data from leaking into the environment. There are mechanisms in place to the extent that we can use them, like a DLP. And then we have processes that say when we discover it, it's immediately removed. We have this process, a ticket is open, the email server is checked for distribution lists, anywhere where that data could be, and we have means of removing it. That's the only one where I kind of thought, the wording kind of sound a little absolute. You prevent it or you include it. But again, from an assessor's perspective, what's reasonable? What's a reasonable measure for you to try to prevent that data from coming in? Other than that, I think where we're really going to have the most QSA sort of thought processes and really diving in are the customized approach. And that's where an entity says, hey, for a control where it's permissible, not all controls are eligible to use a customized approach. We're not going to meet it in accordance with the defined approach. We have our own way that we're going to meet the intent of that control. So there's a lot of risk-based analysis that needs to go behind that and be presented. But your custom solution means that we write custom testing controls for that. So I would say that that's the area where we most expect to have a lot of assessor interpretation, understanding, intention of the control itself and the objective. From the other defined approach requirements, I wouldn't say there's too many that we feel that there's a whole bunch of gray area.
Yeah, thank you. And that's what I've heard, out in the trenches too, is that everyone's trying to hew as closely to the defined approaches to avoid that. Because although it's always fun to do your own stuff, it does require justification, right? I think we're getting to the end here, so I'll wrap up with this because it's kind of close to my heart. This person is in security leadership at a small college, and they have a minimal idea of where to begin with this issue. They have 5 to 7 forms that take payment pages, and they take the users off the page, and they're just not sure where to start. That's literally where we stop it. They're not sure where to begin. And so I spent a long time working in higher ed admin and technology, so I I know a little bit about this thing. My experience so far is that you would want to start thinking about it organizationally a little bit. I mean, in terms of the mapping and the inventorying. So you're going to have your bursar, your treasurer, or et cetera. They're going to have some central IT systems that are, of course, in scope, and they definitely have web pages and et cetera. Second on my list when I'm doing that kind of thinking through is the development office, the folks who do the fundraising, because obviously they're generating cash for the university, no other way to say it. Then the professional schools, if you guys have those, look at those, because sometimes they have shadow IT where they've got their own payment pages out there and they're doing something. And then kind of little wildfire stuff like student groups that may have had a payment page set up through the university's payment gateway provider because of a fundraiser or merchandise or something, those little cases that are out there. So in terms of like where to even start, I take that organizational approach. And then I think that, this might be an interesting transition. There are folks to help out there like Sikich. You guys have a PCI Jumpstart program. Is that correct, Ruth?
Correct. So we really came up with a program that takes a modular approach, not one size fits all. So we have some clients taking advantage of that program where they only want we have an education as phase 1. That's where we do a series of informational workshops. really centered around what's new, roles and responsibilities, customized approach, targeted risk analysis, new inventory requirements, of which there are many. So it's sort of a series of educational conversations. So you really understand these new controls. Phase 2 would be if you'd like for us to do a gap assessment for you. There's then a phase 3 where if you want us to work through remediation and sort of revalidate as you address things. And then obviously phase 4 is the assessment itself. So we allow entities to really choose, what do you need from us? So we're here to help. We're happy to help. Please reach out. Now is the time to do it. I know a year from now may sound like a lot of time, but it really isn't. So absolutely get started. Source Defense obviously has that ability for you to jump right in with their free version for you to use it as a starting point. And then Sikich is available as well if you'd like some guidance from the QSA perspective.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly said. And I didn't mean to cut you off there, but I thought it'd be really useful for folks to see the URL here. Sikich can get you started really fast. I think that probably no matter the size of your organization, whether you're feeling like it's a smaller space or your massive enterprise, Sikich can help you out there at sikich.com. Source Defense, like I said, if you can provide us with even one URL that you're interested in, you're thinking that you need covered, just hit that URL on our webpage here, sourcedefense.com/free PCI. And we can spin up a dashboard, kind of like I showed in brief earlier, for your specific page that you'll have available for free for a while. So to get you started on it and see whether a tool-based thing is right for you, or if you're going to try to tackle it internally, and et cetera. I'm going to take a last call here just for questions. And I just wanted to find out if anybody else has something they'd like to do. There was a lot of participation, so I really appreciate that. So that's why I'm skimming through here and making sure nobody's overlooked. So yeah, some questions about ballpark costs. I'm happy to take that offline. If anyone wants to follow up, we'll be more than glad to do that. And no, I think we covered the big themes. So with that, we'll say thank you, Ruth. Thank you so much. Your experience is invaluable. Sikich is a wonderful partner, and we're really glad to have had you here today.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we're happy to help our clients and other entities who are struggling with this. Just have a jump start on, here's a resource that can help us tackle this problem. So awesome to talk to you as always.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody in the crowd for attending today. If you have any questions, I'm Matthew at sourcedefense.com, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks you very much.
Awesome.